This week on The Futurists, Susan Zieger.
We're in a really hard moment right now in this country in terms of polarization and disconnection. And I think that as humans, we're going to get tired of that.
Hey there, welcome back to The Futurist. I'm Rob Tursik. I'm thrilled to be here. My buddy Brett is en route to Dubai, where we are gathering 35 of the world's greatest futurists together for our first live event. This is something that Brett and I have always wanted to do. And years ago, when we started doing the podcast, we said to each other, someday we're going to do live events. Well, we're finally doing them. We're thrilled about this. And by the time this show airs, we will probably already have been done. We have gathered together a group of futurists, many of whom have been on the show. We know they're the world's leading futurists because the person who put that list together is going to be one of our speakers at the event that's happening in Dubai on the 22nd and 23rd of September at the Jumeirah Beach Hotel. And I'm super excited about this. I have to give the credit to Brett. He's been the one doing all the heavy lifting, putting this event together, pulling people together, inviting speakers, finding sponsors. There's a ton of logistics involved in getting a live event together, especially in a different part of the world. Anyway, I can't wait that this moment is finally here. I'm thrilled to meet many of the people I've only met by Zoom in the past. I'll be meeting them for the first time in person, and there's even a party on a yacht. You can't beat that. So that's all about our big event next week in Dubai. This week, speaking of logistics, Dubai being a major logistics hub, I have a speaker I've been so excited about bringing onto this show, and I'm really thrilled that she is here. We met in person for the first time last night at a book reading. My guest this week is Susan Zieger. Susan is a professor at the University of California in Riverside, and she's also the author of a number of really interesting books that resonate with me. She's written a book about the mediated mind. I'm super interested in media theory, so that's a fun book for me. But the subject we're going to talk about this week is her new book, which is just coming out now, and it's called Logistics and Power. Susan, welcome to the show. It's great to have you here.
Thank you so much, Rob. I'm thrilled to be here.
Now, I'm sure you're a little puzzled when I reached out to you because it's like, how on earth is this going to connect to the Futurists as a podcast? How does a book about the supply chain, which seems so boring to most people, I think it's fascinating, but most people find it to be kind of boring, kind of down in the weeds, kind of the nuts and bolts of our industrial society. However, that stuff is going to be in place for a very, very long time, and changes in the supply chain have a habit of rippling out through society and reshaping it in unexpected ways. And that's really what your book is about. Can you tell us a little bit more about the book? Tell us about Logistics and Power.
Sure. Thank you. So I'm interpreting logistics a bit more broadly than the professional branch of the industry does. So I define it as the efficient movement of goods, people, and information to optimize capital. And so the key there is by broadening it out, I get a little bit more critical traction against, the professional logisticians who are really just interested in getting things from A to B. And I think that's the key to keeping it more exciting and interesting for the rest of us when we think about how we move around as people. This is also involved in logistics and also the flow of information. So it's a kind of a much more massive topic in my interpretation, but that gives it some eclecticism and some more relevance.
In some respects, when I first got acquainted with the book, it struck me that its theme is capital in motion, or the application of capital to the movement of things around the planet. And while most people don't connect the dots between, say, like commercial airlines and, travel, if you're going back to the East Coast for the holidays, they don't connect that to to container ships, or some factory in Shenzhen or something. But the fact is, we wouldn't have a global economy if it weren't for logistics. Logistics is the glue that holds that global economy together. And so that's your starting point. But you go quite a bit broader. As you said, tell us the subtitle of the book, because I think that's an awesome starting point for our conversation.
Sure. The subtitle of the book is Supply Chains from Slavery to Space. And that gives a sense of the historical breadth because I really begin in the 18th century and a little bit even earlier at the beginning of capitalism. I'm applying a kind of world systems theory, which looks at all of the epochs of capitalism. So I really begin with the Dutch, the British, and then we dwell mostly in the American phase.
Great.
So, yeah.
So the book starts with the first phase of globalism. A lot of people think that globalization is something that happened when Bill Clinton was president in the 90s, or maybe a little bit sooner than that. Or some people date it back to the advent of containers in the 1960s. And while those were definitely important moments in shaping the global economy that we have today, the first phase of globalism came shortly after Spanish invaders came to South America. They they didn't stop in Mexico; they kept going till they got to the Philippines and eventually China. And global trade was a big part, even in those days. In the 1500s, huge armadas. We tend to think of the armada was something that came, from the Caribbean to Spain, or occasionally found its way to the English coast to have a little skirmish with the little English Navy. But most people don't know that there was also a big trade with China from the base in Philippines. So that there was a whole actually, that's why Puerto Vallarta existed as a place on the west coast of Mexico, is to ship silver over to China. So globalization's been with us a very, very long time. Now, in some ways, give us a couple of highlights about how that has evolved in the past and how that led to the present moment. How did the past shape our present?
Sure. I mean, certainly, one of the darker passages of history is still has a legacy, and that's the slave trade, and that's where I begin. So, I, I begin with the British, 17th and 18th century. Uh, it's a moment where, for logistics, and slavers, slave traders are thinking about how many people they can fit in the hold of the ship, right? People who have been enslaved are thinking about how they can take back some space for themselves, some freedom, from this awful kind of kidnapping and transportation in the Middle Passage across the Atlantic. But in both of those perspectives, we begin to see a kind of logistical imagination developing
Hmm.
and it's directed against humans, basically, because it's treating them as cargo. So this is why it's important to think about people being moved. And economically, they're being moved for the purposes of labor. They're augmenting the indentured servants who are also, under a certain kind of contract and coercion, but much less egregious than the terrible violence of enslavement. But in thinking about how many people they can put in the ship, and then anti-slavery activists are thinking about how can we negotiate and reform these ships so that they have more air holes, or sort of reform them in some way to make them more humane. These become a set of logistical questions. And I think that that's a really interesting starting point to make this a humanist focused interpretation of logistics rather than one that is, focused on the concerns of cargo and trade and getting things around.
Right. That could lead to a pretty dry book about just shipping goods around the planet. No, there have been some good books written on the subject. The
Sure.
Box by Mark Levinson. I'm sure you've read that. Excellent book on containers. But yes, you're right. There's this tragic human element to it, and it's been there since the very beginning. Right. So that's a dark part of the history, the transport of humans across the ocean. Now, this humanist perspective, I think, is informed somewhat by what you do. Tell people a little bit about your role, because when I first got acquainted with your work, I was like, "What is an English teacher in Riverside doing writing about logistics?" Tell us a little bit about that connection.
Yeah, thanks. So I got into the topic of logistics when I was writing about the British novelist Anthony Trollope about 10 years ago. It was the sesquicentennial of his birth. And Trollope he was a very prolific author. He wrote so many books, but his day job was working for the post office. And so the British post office in the first half of the 19th century, 1830s, 1840s, was modernizing. And Trollope comes on a bit later and gets a very high position trying to figure out how to efficiently get the mail further into the countryside in the British Isles and Ireland. But then also he is put in charge of the imperial mail. And so he really travels around the world, sort of perfecting the system, which is a logistical system for information flow. of how to make the mail more efficient. And it's very interesting to put that together with his novels, and also his writing practice. He was so logistically minded. He came up with a special writing desk with a cushion under it so that he could write on railways. So he was writing all the time. He had a quota. It was like 500 words a day or something. So it's an interesting moment. And the Victorians, if you think about the March of Mind and all of the great projects that, they felt they could sort of do anything. They didn't have any malaise or pessimism yet. They were logistically minded people for sure.
It's interesting. So you making reference a couple of times down this conversation to logistical imagination or the logistical mind. Tell us what you mean by that. What is that?
I think that that's the horizon of thought for people in any different period. When they think about their own mobility, when they think about their own consumption and their labor, they're used to sort of, certain technologies, for us, like certain apps, maybe. And those things contour our expectations, and our imagination of what we might do. So it's kind of a psychological formation.
That's
About
interesting. So that's like the boundary. We're delimited. Our imagination's got a delimiting boundary that is basically what our technology affords us to think about. And whatever is not technologically feasible, well, it's very hard for people to imagine that. So as that scope gradually broadens, as people innovate, new technologies arise, they're applied to logistics and the shipment of goods and people and information. We can start to imagine a little bit further. I mean, in some respects, that's a very futuristic approach. That's a nice way to actually describe what futurists do, right? They're constantly trying to find the adjacent possible. Like what is the next thing that we if this becomes true, then what new possibilities are opened up? That's
Yeah.
the definition of the adjacent possible.
Yeah. So one way to think about that is that we're in the future of the 19th century, right? And so the way that we are constantly checking our phones to, update on news or messages or whatever, that is kind of the ancestor of people pulling out a pocket watch to check the time. So people had to start in the 19th century. Suddenly, you had to be at more places at specific times to get things done. And now, for us, of course, we have to be everywhere all at once, online and in real life. But it's just an
Your phone is the longest ball and chain ever invented.
Yeah.
Um, okay, so take me through the concepts in the book. So your book starts out. Well, you tell me a little bit about the structure of the book, because I know where it goes at the end, and I definitely want to get to that. And I know Brett would love to hear about your thoughts about logistics in space because he's a space geek. But take me through the kind of trajectory of the book.
Sure. So the book is a little bit like two books in a way. The first long chapter is sort of a book within a book. And that's where I kind of reinterpret modernity from the Dutch through the present. I kind of retell that history of capitalism from the point of view of logistics and logistical power. So we know a lot of that story. Some of that story, as you recounted, is familiar to us thinking about the history of logistics, but others, hasn't really figured in it. So I think, for example, the railroad was really important in the United States to producing a kind of managerial power because you couldn't have, you didn't want to have railway accidents. So they had a whole hierarchy. It was almost a military hierarchy of workers. And people had to issue, not just daily, but hourly reports on what was happening with the railroad. And so you can start to see how that sort of organization then is going to come into American corporate organization.
Yes, in some respects, the railroads in the 19th century were the biggest corporations, certainly by stock market capitalization. And this is actually where it connects back, I think, to your concepts about information flow, because there would have been no national railroads or transcontinental railroads if there weren't telegraphs alongside them. So the two technologies go hand in hand. And in fact, the railroads depended on the telegraph to know when a train was coming down the track, so it could divert anything that might be in the way. Plenty of stories in the early 19th century about the failure to do that. They learned that lesson the hard way. Actually, the history of logistics is kind of like the history of a lot of really bad accidents and a lot of really bad tragedies.
Yes.
And they kind of
Yes.
like figuring out ways to work around those in the future, how to prevent that from recurring.
Hmm. Yeah, exactly. So, what the rest of the book does is to sort of delve into topics in logistics and logistical power. So, one of those is the logistical nightmare. So, I kind of have a whole chapter where I'm interpreting that as a cultural concept. Where did it come from? That really develops the military history of logistics.
Hmm.
Of course, logistics important as a tool of capitalism, as we've been describing, but also a military tool, and in that, still a tool of capitalism because a lot of wars were fought to preserve supply routes, to open markets. The two things are, the military always has to turn to commerce to supply it with ammunition and so on.
It's true. You're right. I mean, global conquest and global trade go hand in hand, right? One precedes the other. You can't have one without the other, I suppose, until you run into a formidable opponent who says, no, you can't do conquest, but we can strike a deal. We can trade. We got something you might need. And that's kind of the history of China, right? Like they weren't that interested. The British didn't really have much to offer them. Um, so let's talk a little bit about the power aspect, the second half of your title,
Mhm.
because everything we've been saying so far seems to point in that direction that every new technological development in moving goods, sometimes moving people, leads to new mechanisms of control.
Mhm.
Tell me more about that if you could. Is that a theme through the book?
Yeah, definitely. So logistical power is sort of the political and social and economic expression of logistics. So logistics changes through history as its technologies change, but the lot of the dominant features of logistical power have a long through line. So, for example, you could think about flow as an important concept that describes the continuousness of logistics. And flow is important for the supply chains, but it's also workflow. And it's also the way that we, as workers and consumers, experience immersion. And it's very pleasurable when you're working and you're in the zone, and you're getting things done and time is passing, but you don't even notice. That's called being in flow. And it's a psychological concept from the 70s. It's very desirable.
Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, I think, is the
Yep.
scientist who came up with that.
I was going to let you pronounce it.
Yeah, it's a tricky one. I got to rehearse that. I'm not sure if I got it quite right, but it's a Czech name, so I'm going to take a pass. I think it's Csikszentmihalyi. But that's an important concept for creative people. We don't tend to think of creativity as part of logistics, that idea of flow. But what you're saying, I think, is if there's some structure around any work that you can kind of get into that. It's not a mindless state, but it's like a Zen state of mind where you feel mastery and therefore it's flowing through you, like productivity is flowing through you. So
Right.
a moment ago, you talked about the railroads and the need for a kind of military type precision and a hierarchy of control. And I think that's probably true to the present and will be true in the future that if you're going to have logistics, you've got to have control, which brings things like schedules, timetables, clocks, pocket watches, like you mentioned, planning, right? All of these things become instruments of control viewed from that perspective. I don't think we tend to think of it that way in business, but I think when you look at it through the lens of getting goods efficiently from point A to point B on a timeline, to maximize capital, to maximize profit, then it's very much about control and it's very much about power. So the power is like almost like an emergent principle. If you're going to do logistics, you're going to have somebody with the power to control the supply chain. But there's a second half of that, right, which is about the imposition of these rules and systems on subject territories or subject peoples. And is that also part of your book? Because I think you do touch on colonial theory, right?
Oh, yeah, definitely. So, I mean, it's part of the logistical nightmare chapter and the history of militarism to think about the control of supply chains as the way that colonies are governed. And, that is something that we can still see around us, even since we're past the sort of formal age of the British Empire. And, but for example, Puerto Rico is still a territory of the United States.
Yeah.
And some people call that the oldest colony.
Yeah, they do. You go to
Yeah.
San Juan, it's like very clearly in the graffiti, right? Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And so if you go back to the first Trump administration in 2017, when Hurricane Maria hit, it was a real disaster. They lost power for almost over a year.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of criticism of FEMA ships for creating a logistical nightmare in which they had the ship parked, in the harbor, but they couldn't get the supplies up into the mountainous part of Puerto Rico. And so people were, and then when they got it there, they would open up the food supplies, and it was stuff like candy. So it was just kind of a disaster from start to finish. And Puerto Ricans really had to band together and try to help each other, like in a sort of
Right.
mutual aid kind of way.
Help was not forthcoming. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a famous black eye for FEMA. One group that you would expect would have their act together when it comes to logistics. After a natural disaster, we expect somebody to come in and reorganize things, maybe impose order, if it's necessary to do that. But actually, unfortunately, yeah, the history of natural disasters tends to be that the aftermath is really poorly orchestrated. That
Yes. So that's actually my point about logistical power is that, that expectation that FEMA or that the government is going to come in and set things right actually overlooks the way that the status quo of governance is typically kind of abysmal and extractive. And so they're not really going to come in and help their colony. They
no,
don't want
yeah.
to, you know,
Yeah, it's funny. Nowadays, there's a whole group of people who are kind of like apologists for the colonial era, and they'll say, "Well, we actually helped bring those people into the modern era and so forth." This is not true. This is a very easy thing to disprove. The colonial legacy is still with us. Folks who know me know that I'm keenly interested in decolonial theory and spent some time at the University of Utrecht studying the subject with the people who came up with these theories. I'm passionate about the subject because the residue of the colonial era is with us to this day. It's in the United States. It's baked into our legal code. It's baked into our Constitution. Many people in the United States are very fond of citing the Constitution as the most perfect instrument of governance. It's not true. I mean, it's filled with flaws, and many of them are because it was developed in a colonial era with a colonial mindset. Now, that colonial mindset lingers. So even after, the colonizer leaves, the colonial mindset and actually the colonial infrastructures stay. One of the things that's interesting to this day, there is no railroad that covers the continent of Africa. There's no transcontinental railroad. And the reason for that is that all the railroads in Africa are designed to extract resources from the center and bring them to the ports. And so all the railroads kind of go out from the center. They don't go through or connect in any useful way. To this day, why? Well, in the 1960s and 70s, when the colonial powers left, they certainly weren't going to build that railroad, so they pull it out. And the new people came in, typically, because there was typically a military group that came in through after a civil war or an uprising or a rebellion of some sort, they were in no position to reset the infrastructure, and as a result, they got stuck with the legacy. And so we still have that legacy of the colonial infrastructure to this very day in Africa. And many of those economies are still based on the same extractive economics, which is to say that they ship raw materials out. The raw materials are transported in with modern infrastructure with container ships. Those raw materials are taken to the metropole, some advanced nation, industrial nation, where they're turned into finished goods and sent back to the former colony to be consumed. So the colonial economics are still with us. And once you start to notice that, once you become aware of that, you start to see it everywhere around you. I know that's an element that you've been thinking about. You spoke about it at the book reading that I was so delighted to go to last night. That was really fun to see you read from the book. I think actually it was quite interesting to me how funny you were when you read it. Like I was very charmed by the section that you read. It's very fun to hear you read the book. I hope other people will find a chance to hear you read this book, because it's so entertaining. But the theme that came through clearly to me was that you're quite aware of decolonial theory, and some of that is reflected in your work. Is that because you have written? You've taught the literature of the British Empire, right? That's one of your subjects that you teach at Riverside.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you're conscious of that.
I would say that, it's funny just to talk about Victorian studies for a moment, but from the 1990s, imperial history and decolonial theory really overtook the field and became the dominant paradigm. Now it's the climate crisis, and so people are reinterpreting Victorian literature through, the coal economy and things like that.
Oh, that's quite interesting. Oh, so we look back now at you can bring a fresh interpretation based on the current crisis to historical epics. Okay, so well, Susan, this has been a fun conversation. Let's hold on for 1 second. We're going to take a break, and we'll come back in just a moment after a word from our sponsors. So, folks, you're listening to The Futurist, and my guest is Susan Zieger, and we'll be back in just a minute. Hang tight.
Provoke Media is proud to sponsor, produce, and support the Futurist podcast. Provoke.fm is a global podcast network and content creation company with the world's leading fintech podcast and radio show, Breaking Banks. And of course, its spin-off podcast, Breaking Banks Europe, Breaking Banks Asia Pacific. But we also produce the official Finovate podcast, Tech on Reg, and Emerge Everywhere, the podcast of the Financial Health Network. For information about all our podcasts, go to provoke.fm or check out Breaking Banks, the world's #1 fintech podcast and radio show.
Hey, welcome back to The Futurist. I'm Rob Tursik, and today I'm talking to Susan Zieger, who is a professor of English at the University of California in Riverside. And she's written this super interesting book, Logistics and Power. Two topics I'm fascinated by. So we've been having a fun conversation looking back at the kind of colonial past in the previous section. But now we're going to shift our focus to the future, starting with the present moment. And Susan, tell me a little bit about how the advent of container shipping in the 1960s and 70s reshaped society and the global economy. That's a big topic. You could go for a long time on that.
Yeah, well, I'm standing on the shoulders of Mark Levinson's book, The Box, for that one.
Great book.
But basically, it's the standardization and the intermodality of the container that allowed for flow. And so we talked a little bit about flow in terms of workflow and psychological flow, and the flow of goods is craning them off the ship onto the truck bed, and away they go, and everything is sort of moving more continuously. So
I tend to take that for granted. I mean, I think most people are very dimly conscious of the logistics behind getting, the thing you ordered on Amazon delivered to your front door. We click and then we forget about it and go back to something else. And the next day, some pleasant person is standing outside of your doorstep with a box. But an awful lot of parts have to move in the background to make that happen. And I say this because there's actually a Temu shipment on its way to my house right now. So here I am, supporting the other team, I guess, getting my goods straight from China. But it is quite an extraordinary story, right? This globe-spanning network of containers. At any given moment, there's 5,000 ships on the sea and some 1.5 million containers in motion, right? So all this metal in motion constantly around the planet, and packed inside of it is everything from electronics to food to clothing. Basically, every single thing that you can find in a Home Depot or a Target or a Walmart was delivered there by a container ship. People often decry the decline of manufacturing in the United States and the loss of, good paying jobs, as the politicians say in their garbled English. All of that is a side effect of globalization, and modern globalization happened because of the container. So that metal box, and alongside it, the barcode, right? So a few months ago, I had an interview, episode 273 of The Futurist, with Melanie Hilton from GS1. And Melanie is the head of innovation for GS1, which is the global standards body for the supply chain's data standards. It's one of the largest standards bodies in the world. And there are more than 1 million member companies of that organization. They are all of the manufacturers, distributors, shipping companies, and retailers in the world. And all of those containers that are moving around the planet are governed by supply chain standards, data standards, like that famous UPC barcode that you scan. So if you're interested in that subject, look for episode 273 of The Futurists. We talked a bit about that. But even when I was talking to Melanie, one of the things that was on my mind is that this is another instrument of control. Global standards are absolutely designed to control the flow of goods and services. And the way they come about, for people who aren't familiar with that process, they're not imposed. You can't impose a standard. Standards have to be agreed to, and they are negotiated, and parties differ. And sometimes it can take years to get to an agreement. And that is really a principal part of what an organization like GS1 does. is they host the meetings and they serve as like a neutral host for those discussions, which can be very contentious, to get everybody on the same page and to agree to a common standard. And typically in business, the way that works is it takes a couple of years to get to a standard. Everybody agrees on the standard, and then we compete like mad on top of that standard. And so that's the competition part. But capitalism, modern capitalism, as we understand it, could not function without standards. If you didn't have standards for things like electrical sockets, you couldn't have electric manufacturers making all the gadgets that we like. But that extends across everything, including the standard sizes for garments, all the standards for packaging, like the sizes of packages. All of that stuff is negotiated. But these are as I was saying, these are instruments of control as well. They are negotiated, but then once they're agreed to, you have to comply. If you want to be a part, if you want to participate in the economy, you've got to submit yourself to these standards. Does that come up in your book? Is that part of what you discuss, how the supply chain governs behavior or dictates the way capitalism functions?
Yes. I'm kind of looking at the supply chain from a more humanistic perspective, and that pretty much means thinking about the workers along the supply chain and the workers in e-commerce, and the way that e-commerce is really in the warehouses in Amazon, for example, but throughout the whole industry. It's kind of divided at the moment between human workers and robots. And so if you imagine the inside of an Amazon warehouse, you've got a giant, sort of like a Roomba underneath a stack of shelves. And this will slide forward towards a human worker standing at a monitor who's going to pick and pull items out of the shelves and, send them on to be packed. And so there's a couple of things happening there. One is, to tie into what you're saying, the standardization of the robots and the system, the control of that system, is a kind of technological miracle of some kind. But then you also have a worker who's being asked to kind of stand still for their entire shift. They used to be walking around the shelves and picking things out, so that was also grueling. But it's actually difficult.
Yeah, right. They would walk like 17 miles a day inside
Yeah.
of the warehouse, right, during a shift.
Yeah. But so now they're low paid, right? It's a tough job and it's not well paid. And there's a enormous churn and burn as, people come in and out of the jobs because they're so tough. But what they need, that they can't quite replicate yet with robots, is human dexterity and intelligence. And so intelligence is very much not only of the mind, but it's connected to the hand and to the body.
That pick and pack part where the human is grabbing something in the bin and making sure it's the right part that goes in the box and putting it into the box. That part is hard for the servo mechanics of robots to do properly without crushing it by accident if it's a delicate item, or even discerning the right item amongst a selection of different things in a box. So
Exactly.
that part is effectively they're mechanizing the human worker, turning him into a biological robot, a person whose job definition has been shrunken down to you get to do the part that the machines can't do yet. That's the human piece. So when you say the humanistic perspective, apart from decrying that mechanization of human labor, what else is included in the humanistic perspective of the supply chain?
I would say also the environment is part of that, because logistics, if you just think about the traveling salesperson's problem as a kind of schematic for logistics, this is the famous math problem where a traveling salesperson has a certain number of cities to visit. And so how does one calculate the most efficient route? Right. So if you imagine that, it gets quite complex. You only need, after you have 12 cities, it turns into 80 billion different possible routes, for example. So if you imagine, though, the blank space between those points, if you're looking at the math problem, it's just the white paper behind the drawing of the routes. That is actually the imagination of the places through which logistics moves, right? Logistics is only interested in moving quickly through a place. And so it's not going to stop and dwell there, and it's not going to regard the humans who live there. So there's a way in which all of the shipping, all the containers, all the trucking, it's partly the emissions from those things that creates the bad air. For example, in Riverside, where I teach, that impacts the people who are inhabiting those places. So they're kind of like the forgotten people in the logistical mindset, which is just how fast, how predictably.
So what you're saying is the supply chain reshapes the physical environment that we live in.
Yeah.
And we don't tend to notice that. For folks who are listening who aren't from Southern California, the part of the country where Susan teaches is just east. It's inland from Los Angeles towards the desert. And when I first moved here in the 1990s, that area was blank space on the map. You could drive right through it. But today, it is filled with enormous logistics centers, these gigantic warehouses that seem to go on for miles, and they're kind of faceless and bland, and they're highly standardized, back to that concept, because they're designed to be identical no matter where they are. So one of the consequences of globalization and this ever-sprawling supply chain is the standardization of the landscape that humans move in, and you decry that because you see that as kind of like subtracting the humanistic element or the regional element, the part that makes it unique and maybe interesting to humans. There's no question about it. Those buildings are boring. Like they're boring by design, right? They're there to be efficient and to move goods from one place to another, and they're not really there to beautify the place. They're not really there to be noticed by people.
Yeah, exactly right. And I think it also extends to consumerism. I can't remember which episode it was, but you were talking about malls, I think. And the identicalness of the logistics facilities is mirrored in the same Westfield shopping center in any city that you pick.
I mean, we might say the logic of capitalism is to commodify human desire, right? So the imagination of capitalism is to look at a human being, and say, what are all the things a human needs in their life, and then imagine a way to supply that, a way to scratch that itch, some new good or service that's going to scratch that itch that people will pay for. And this extends beyond physical goods, beyond things like, food and clothing and shelter that we all need. It extends to things like human relationships. So this is one of the most insidious parts of, I think, social networks, right? Because effectively what they're doing is commodifying human relationships. So, I have friends, I meet people as I travel. I want to stay in touch with them. So, hey, LinkedIn or Facebook, or I want to share pictures of my travels. Hey, then you use Instagram. And so, they're attractive, they're convenient, they're easy to use. They do allow us to stay in touch, but you're staying in touch through somebody else's system and you're paying for that. Your information becomes their product. Actually, your relationships become Facebook's product in that context. And it doesn't stop there. Like the insidious logic of capitalism is to push its tentacles further and further in. So we get a little further into relationships, into, let's say, dating, and love. And suddenly there's marketplaces like eHarmony, or maybe, something a little bit faster and more current like Tinder. Or then you get to something that, replaces the relationship entirely and just commodifies sex. And then we have, OnlyFans or, Pornhub or something like that. The point is, the business of capitalism is to figure out what people want, what their needs are, and turn it into a product or a service that can be made profitably, that can be supplied profitably. And the supply chain is there to deliver it most efficiently. This is an inexorable process. And in your book, you don't stop there. You actually extend this to space. And this is the most revelatory part for me, is supply chain in space. I did not know about it. It was real news for me. And in the book, I think it's one of the most interesting topics. Tell us a little bit about this speculative aspect of the supply chain. What the heck are we doing in space with supply chain?
Yeah, well, this has been all the rage for the last maybe 10, 12 years since NASA began working with commercial outfits like SpaceX. Uh, Basically, there's a couple different ways to think about it. For one, there are the sort of big public projects, like there's the Artemis project is supposed to return to the moon, and then of course there's Elon Musk's desire to go to Mars, right? But then there's also, in terms of logistics, there's terrestrial logistics that uses space. So this would be package and passenger delivery that would launch goods and people into low Earth orbit and bring them down on the other side of the planet, leveraging the Earth's rotation to do that more quickly than they ever could move those things, through an airplane or a container ship.
That seems awfully expensive. You mean like a spaceship launch to put goods into orbit?
Yes. Yeah, and so you could put them into orbit, and they could stay in orbit, and then brought back down when needed. Or if you needed something desperately from China, like today, they could launch it, and you would get it in a few hours if they brought it.
Oh, I see. Oh, so that's kind of like a logical extension of, say, hypersonic or supersonic jet travel, where they can just rocket the thing into space and get it down to you in a few hours. I think you mentioned last night that the U.S. military is investigating this, of course, because if hey, warehouses in space sounds like something the military could find useful. Tell me a little bit more about the military aspect.
Yeah. So, I mean, right now, there's also an important sort of military event going on in terms of controlling information and satellites in space. But
Yeah.
this part has to do with cargo. Right now, if a military needed to deploy somewhere, the fastest that they could do it at the farthest distance is 18 hours for the U.S. military's
So
immediate.
that's like military airlift. They've got all the stuff ready to go on the tarmac. They load the plane, get the people on the plane, and boom, 18 hours later, there's a fighting force on the ground somewhere.
Right. But obviously, if you could have all that material in space, and if you could, use the same methods to launch people and get them to where they were going, you could do it faster. So being able to use space, in these military ways to undertake armed conflict on the ground on Earth would give whoever had it this tremendous capability. Because
Incredible. So you mean like munitions and supplies, non-perishable, so goods could be stored almost like warehouses in space
Mhm.
in orbit and then brought down as needed. When you talk about the logistical imagination, this is it. Like this is
Yeah.
the way logistics people think. They're like, what's the next thing what's the next play? Oh, hey, there's all this space that's not being used up here. Let's put some satellites up there. Let's put some containers in space. It's worth pointing out, too, that already space has been colonized in some respects for the purposes of sending information back and forth, starting with telecommunications satellites, but probably most importantly for most people today is GPS. You wouldn't have a supply chain, you wouldn't have shipping, you wouldn't have that delivery from Amazon come into your front door if we didn't have GPS. So the global positioning system, that satellite system is absolutely essential. And last night you talked a little bit about Elon Musk's SpaceX satellites, those micro satellites, of which there are already half the satellites in geosynchronous orbit are owned by SpaceX. It's extraordinary how many thousands of satellites they put up, and they have plans to launch tens of thousands more, littering the planet with space junk. Which is visible from the ground. When I went to Yosemite last summer, we laid out at night looking at the stars. And one of the people I was hiking with pointed up and said, "Look, there goes a SpaceX satellite." It was quite obviously not not a star or a planet because it was moving in a straight line. It was very bright, and so it's quite easy to see those things when you're not in a city. So here's another way that it's kind of changing our human experience of the environment. We're redesigning it, maybe not in such aesthetically pleasing ways. We're cluttering the nighttime sky, and certainly astronomers will tell you that all that space junk interferes with their ability to detect planetary motion and to do space observations. So, okay, gosh, we keep veering towards this kind of critique, but this is actually something that's relevant for you, right? I mean, this is subject matter that you're interested in. Rethinking capitalism is something that when you worked at the Rockefeller Institution, the Rockefeller Foundation, you were thinking a bit about rethinking capitalism.
Yeah, what I find really influential coming out of this research on logistics is actually a theory of degrowth,
Mhm.
which is kind of an awkward word, maybe not that sellable, but I'm going to try. And it basically counters the notion that we have to have endless growth in our economy, right? Because that's why we have so many satellites and so many supply chains, and everything is.
So much garbage and so much landfill, so much plastic in these gyres in the middle of the ocean.
Yes, yeah, it's because the imagination of the capitalists that you were describing a few minutes ago about stoking desire, it has no endpoint.
And
So
desire never lasts, right? So we get bored. Hey, we order the thing on Amazon. It shows up on Monday. Awesome. By Tuesday, I'm bored. I want something else. I got to scratch that itch again.
Exactly.
Fast fashion is probably the biggest culprit here because that stuff is designed to be obsolete. Literally everything in an H&M or Zara store is intended to be a landfill and will be within a year on average.
Oh yeah, and not only that, when you think of how like the distribution of labor, 1 in 6 workers works in the fashion industry,
Wow,
which is kind of astonishing to me.
that is astonishing. And no doubt they're working in excellent conditions,
Right.
very reasonable hours, and very good pay. I'm being sarcastic. Okay, so tell me a little bit about rethinking capitalism for the future. How do you see this progressing? We're talking about using the space as, as an element of the supply chain. In some respects, it already is for the distribution of information. Tell me what your vision is 20 years out. How do you think this is going to continue? Will we stop growing? Do you think that's feasible? Is degrowth on the agenda? Will we hit a wall?
I kind of think that degrowth might have more possibility than not, because if you think about declining population
Hmm.
around the world, and then you think that a lot of people are coming to the realization that they don't quite need an H&M garment like every other day.
A fuzzy coat for this fall. Yeah,
You know,
already
you
got one.
Yeah, exactly. So, I think people don't really want like quite a lot of what's being served up to them at the moment. It's too overwhelming and it's disconnecting us from each other. We're in a really hard moment right now in this country in terms of polarization and disconnection. And I think that as humans, we're going to get tired of that. So I hope it happens within 20 years. And I hope that people begin to kind of think about supply chains a little bit more about labor and economics, and just sort of questioning, like, what do I really want in my life?
Yeah, what do I need?
Yeah.
There's
And so,
a big part of the marketing. We've been talking a lot about the distribution and logistics of the products of capitalism, but we haven't talked much about the marketing and presentation. Um, a, a big part of marketing is to mix people up, is to confuse people's understanding of want versus need. And I would say to this day, most people are going to have a tough time distinguishing between what they really need versus what they really want. So that may be an area to start focusing on if it's about degrowth. We have talked about this notion that the population is going to flatten. Population growth has ceased in the northern hemisphere. In the United States, the only reason we continue to have population growth in the U.S. is immigration. Of course, that's under tremendous pressure and pushback from nativists and the United States and populists here. But bear in mind, that's also what pays for Social Security. So for all those aging yuppies, if you want to retire comfortably, it's going to be an immigrant that pays your Social Security in the future because that's the way the system works. I hate to break it to those people that want to shut the doors for good. Other nations in the Northern Hemisphere are all below replacement rate, notably China, Japan, and most importantly, Korea, substantially below the replacement rate of 2.1 children per couple. And as a result, their forecast looks pretty dire. About 50 years out, you start to see a catastrophic decline in the number of people, because that's, of course, a compounding issue, right? When you have fewer people and a lower replacement rate, that compounds. And so you start very quickly, in a matter of 2 or 3 generations, you start to see a significant decrease. So your premise is that that will drive degrowth. We don't have to have the political battle about degrowth. Of course, what will come with that are all the social systems that modern democracies, industrial countries have. They all depend on this concept of permanent growth, forever growth. So if we go into degrowth mode, we're going to have to rethink the economy and our politics along with it.
oh yeah, I think
Topics for future conversation, I suppose.
yeah, I think the real question at the moment is, are people going to get to express their desires in the way that we've been used to as a democracy? Can we continue to express our political will? Or are we going to be controlled by authoritarians who are going to force us to reproduce, let's say? I think we're going to find out.
Wow. Okay, that's a grim Orwellian thought to close out our show here. It's been such a pleasure getting to know you, and I've enjoyed talking to you today. Tell us, where can people find out more about your book, and where can they find out more about you?
They can go to susanzieger.com. If they spell my last name correctly, it's Zieger. And they can get the book at the usual places online.
Oh,
And yeah.
And the book is Logistics and Power. And the subtitle, oh, there it is. Look, show it. Yeah, hold it up. Great. There it is. Logistics and Power, Supply Chains from Slavery to Space. Well, as a supply chain geek, this has been a pure pleasure. Thank you for indulging me in my rambling questions and conversation, talking about the implications of our current global economy for the future. And folks, every week we'll bring you another person who's focused on the future, whose work is shaping and influencing the future that we're all going to participate in. I want to give a shout out to the folks at Provoke Media who make the show possible, to Kevin Hirschhorn and Lisbeth Severance, who produced the show for us, and to my business partner, Brett King, who has been working tirelessly, not just to build up the Futures Network and the Futures Podcast, but also our big event that's coming up in Dubai. And so I'm excited about all of that. And probably the next time you'll hear from me, I will be coming to you from Dubai. I'm excited to tell you that. That'll be happening very soon, next week. So looking forward to that. Until then, I'll see you in the future. Well, that's it for The Futurists this week. If you like the show, we sure hope you did. Please subscribe and share it with the people in your community. And don't forget to leave us a 5-star review. That really helps other people find the show. And you can ping us anytime on Instagram and Twitter at Futurist Podcast for the folks that you'd like to see on the show or the questions that you'd like us to ask. Thanks for joining. And as always, we'll see you in the future.